I think for a lot of people, we're hearing Luhansk and Donetsk, the Donbass region, all about this thrown into the international spotlight. But to give us a little bit of background, that's where this latest escalation is centred, of course, with President Putin recognising the independence of those regions. What's the significance of that?
Well, it's very significant because Vladimir Putin's plan was to use these as levers, as pressure points on the Ukrainian government to make sure that they could never join the EU or NATO. And by recognising Luhansk and Donetsk, he's it seems, given up on that for the moment. It's now giving him carte blanche in his own book to commit military resources formally, because of course there were Russian troops there before and there was Russian assistance to these regions before, but now they can formally move in, set up their military bases. And what's very worrying is that he's now said today, Vladimir Putin, that when he says he recognises Donetsk and Luhansk, he recognises the entire regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, only 1/3 of which are under the control of these so-called separatist authorities. So it seems that if the separatist authorities try to expand to, make their claim on the other parts of Donetsk and Luhansk no longer under their control, then the Russians will back them, and that would lead to a full-scale conflagration. I think that's the big fear right now.
Do you think that'll be the next escalation? Because the Russian so-called peacekeeping troops are in there now, and it's defining where the borders are in these new independent states, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons why the sanctions that were announced today were somewhat underwhelming is because there's somehow an expectation that that is the plan, that it's not going to just consolidate the area that's under the control of the separate authorities. It is going to expand and bring it into confrontation with the Ukrainian government, and they're kind of holding back on throwing the kitchen sink in terms of sanctions until that happens. Unfortunately, that seems to be the reality now. That, we were told, remember, we were being asking ourselves for months now, what is Vladimir Putin thinking? What's his plan? Now his plan has more or less revealed itself. It actually, NATO was a ruse in a way. It was going to be always about Donetsk and Luhansk, it seems.
All right, OK. We can cross live now to Iveagh House, where the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Simon Coveney, is standing by. Minister, you're welcome along to the programme tonight. And we heard Taoiseach Micheál Martin in Berlin earlier today talking about Russia, as I say, crossing the line. Joe Biden taking those sentiments a step further tonight, saying this is the beginning of a Russian invasion. Do you think it is?
Well, I think it's hard to deny the facts. I mean, what Russia has done is essentially recognise part of Ukraine as independent states. And he's moving tanks into that territory. So, he is effectively moving Russian military hardware into parts of what the world recognises as Ukraine. So, yes, that is a start of an invasion of sorts. But I think, the EU, the UK, the US have been somewhat cautious in terms of how they've responded to that. Yes, we're introducing sanctions, and they're targeted sanctions. But as you've just heard from your previous speaker, it's not the full package yet. And that is because we haven't given up on diplomacy, and we shouldn't either, because the alternative is war, is the death of thousands and thousands of people in Europe, and of course extreme sanction measures working both ways, one in retaliation to the other, and everybody loses in that scenario. So we have to try to avert that, and that is why the sanctions package that has been announced this evening is real, and it's targeted, but it is certainly not as far as the EU, the US and the UK and others indeed are willing to go. So we'll have to wait and see what happens now. But certainly the language that we heard today coming from Russia in the Duma, which is their parliament, wouldn't inspire any confidence or positivity.
What I want to ask,
at the moment, there's a lot of beating of war drums, and I think we have to find a way of trying to diffuse that build-up of tension. But it's hard to do that, given the really aggressive actions of Russia and its president.
On these sanctions, so that there are incremental steps here. But the question is, by announcing these, is there any point to them? Like, will they act as a disincentive at all?
I think they will. I mean, the individuals have been sanctioned. I mean, the entire membership, effectively, of the Duma have been sanctioned in terms of asset freezes, travel bans. And of course, a number of Russian banks, including the Russian Central Bank, will not be able to raise money on European markets now or EU markets. So these are real sanctions. Don't make any mistake there. But I think the EU is willing to go a lot further in terms of targeting other economic sensitive areas if they need to. But of course, the main focus here has got to be to prevent war, as opposed to plan for how we respond to a war when it takes place. And that means intelligent and firm diplomacy, which I hope we will see in the next day or so.
So what would trigger the next step in sanctions if there's a whole tranche of sanctions ready to go here? Is everything now guided by how Russia moves? Essentially, Vladimir Putin holding the cards?
Well, he does hold a lot of the cards. I mean, he's sending so-called peacekeepers into Luhansk and Donetsk. But, peacekeepers don't arrive in tanks and attack helicopters. So that in itself is not credible. But as your previous speaker also said, in these regions, the separatists only control about a third of those areas, which essentially is Russia-supported separatists. And so really, I think the next point of tension is whether the Russian military is going to look to push to take control of the remainder of those two regions, Luhansk and Donetsk. And if they do that, it means significant conflict with the Ukrainian armed forces. And I think that is the next point of concern and tension. And should that full-scale military confrontation happen, then of course I think the EU will respond with a much tougher package of sanctions, and certainly the US and UK and others will as well. But we have to try to ensure that that doesn't happen through diplomatic intervention.
And on those diplomatic,
whether that's going to work,
on those diplomatic interventions,
I think more and more
Minister,
people are getting pessimistic at this stage.
Yeah, that pessimism that's there when we see that all diplomatic effort so far has failed. What makes you think now that diplomacy will work here?
Well, it may not. I mean, that's the blunt reality here. Diplomacy has failed so far. And Russia has essentially, concocted arguments around the expansion of NATO and so on as a threat to Russia that they need to act to reverse. They've essentially created tension within eastern Ukraine, accusing Ukrainians of attacking Russian citizens in eastern Ukraine and so on, as a pretext essentially for military action to protect Russian interests. And although there has, of course, been a war in eastern Ukraine, I mean, nearly 14,000 people have been killed in that war over the last number of years. What's happening now is a significant ratcheting up of that tension. And of course, we've seen this extraordinary Russian military buildup in the Black Sea, south of Ukraine, in Belarus, north of Ukraine, where we've seen about 170,000 Russian troops with an enormous amount of hardware. They're even moving blood now and blood supplies to the border as well. So these are not good signals. And so while we should not give up on diplomacy, we shouldn't be naive either at the real intentions here of Russia.